It started like any other weekend, a simple invitation to a party hosted by an old acquaintance of mine, Paul. My wife, Emma, and I weren't strangers to events like these. We usually blended in well, enjoying the laughter, the buzz of conversations, and the hum of background music. But that night, from the moment we arrived, something felt off. At first, it was subtle. Emma's laugh rang a little louder than usual, her smile clinging to her lips like it had been stretched there by sheer will. I didn't think much of it. We had argued the night before over something trivial, forgotten groceries or her sister's wedding plans, something that had left a residue of tension between us. I figured this party would smooth things over. I believed we needed a distraction. What I didn't realize was that I was offering her the perfect escape. The house was packed, a whirl of faces both familiar and unfamiliar, and the low hum of drinks being poured echoed through the rooms. Emma looked radiant, dressed in a slinky black dress that clung to her figure just enough to hint at allure without seeming desperate. She stood by my side, her arm brushing against mine, as we greeted Paul with warm smiles. But it didn't take long for her attention to drift, more quickly than I expected. At first, I caught her glancing toward a group of people across the room. Her eyes hovered too long on one particular figure, a man I hadn't seen before. He stood with his back against the bar, casually holding a whiskey glass, his easy grin a little too self-assured for my liking. I noticed her eyes linger on him, and it gave me a prickling sense of unease. There was something deliberate about the way she kept checking if he was watching. Emma excused herself to get a drink, and though I tried to brush it off, I couldn't stop myself from following her movements with my gaze. She wandered straight to him. I watched as she tilted her head slightly, introduced herself, and laughed too hard at something he said. My stomach twisted, but I told myself not to overthink it. It's just a conversation. It means nothing. Yet, it didn't stop. She stepped by his side for the better part of the evening, her body language loosening with every drink she had. I tried to participate in conversations, but my eyes kept drifting back to them. Her hand brushed his arm lightly, too lightly to be intentional, but too familiar to be innocent. I watched, rooted to the spot, as if paralyzed by my own helplessness. Every time their heads leaned in closer, every time her laugh rang out, it chipped away at me a little more. I downed my drink faster than I should have, telling myself I was being irrational. She's just being friendly. That's what I wanted to believe. But with every passing moment, it became harder to convince myself that this was just casual. There was an intimacy growing between them, a bubble forming that excluded me entirely, and no matter how many times I tried to look away, I couldn't unsee it. As the night wore on, Emma drifted further away. I joined a group of mutual friends, half listening to stories and jokes, but my heart wasn't in it. From across the room, I caught glimpses of her, her hand on the small of his back, his fingers grazing her arm. She hadn't so much as looked in my direction for the past hour. Then came the moment I dreaded, the point where politeness melted into indulgence. As the crowd grew more intoxicated, the room's energy shifted. People began dancing in clusters, the music blaring louder, laughter becoming sloppier. It was chaos, a blur of bodies and movement. But even in the midst of it all, I could still find her. I could still see Emma, glued to that man, the lines between playful flirtation and something darker dissolving right before my eyes. I told myself it was the alcohol that was making me overthink things. I wanted to trust her, but my trust was wearing thin. Something inside me cracked, a voice whispering that this wasn't just innocent fun, that maybe, just maybe, there was more beneath the surface of her actions. As the hours slipped by, the mood of the party shifted further, taking on an edge of recklessness. I started noticing couples disappearing into side rooms, and I knew then that the night was approaching dangerous territory. When Emma suddenly excused herself from the man's side and slipped into the hallway, my body tensed. She didn't even glance my way before she vanished. I stood there, rooted in place, waiting, hoping she would reappear in minutes, smiling and reassuring me with her presence. But she didn't. That's when I heard it. At first, the noise was faint, just a distant burst of laughter coming from somewhere down the hall. Then, as if someone had twisted a volume dial, The sound sharpened, followed by a man's voice, slurring with intoxicated amusement, rising above the music. "Stop! Stop! You're naked!" My breath stalled. I felt a cold knot in my stomach twist into something darker. I knew that voice. It was him, and before I could stop myself, I was already moving through the crowd, weaving between the swaying bodies and stumbling conversations, my pulse roaring in my ears. When I reached the hallway, I saw her. Emma came running out of a side room, completely naked, her face flushed and her hair in disarray. For a moment, the world tilted beneath me. It was surreal, like something out of a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. Her bare feet slapped against the wooden floor as she staggered into the main room, giggling drunkenly, oblivious to the stunned faces turning toward her. I froze, every nerve in my body locking in place as the scene unfolded in slow motion. Conversations dropped off one by one as people registered what they were seeing. My wife, exposed and laughing, utterly unashamed. She stumbled, almost falling, and the man from earlier, the one she'd spent the night with, appeared behind her, hurriedly yanking his shirt back on. His voice, amused and exasperated, echoed through the room. "Jesus, Emma, what the hell are you doing?" Every eye was on us now. The room fell into a stunned silence, thick with disbelief and judgment. Emma, oblivious to the weight of what she'd done, collapsed in a heap on the floor, her drunken giggles fizzling out into confused murmurs. And there I stood, frozen in place, humiliated beyond words. The shame hit me like a tidal wave, the kind that sweeps away any shred of dignity you have left. I could feel the heat of every gaze burning into me, and my mind screamed at me to do something, to cover her up, to save face. But all I could do was stand there, helpless and exposed, as if I were the one who had been stripped bare in front of everyone. Something inside me snapped. Rage surged through me, and before I knew what I was doing, I was moving toward the man she'd spent the night with. My fist connected with his jaw before I even realized I'd thrown the punch, and we both went crashing to the floor. Chaos erupted around us as people scrambled to pull us apart. I swung wildly, blinded by fury, desperate to reclaim even a fraction of my pride. But the damage was already done. I'd lost her. Or maybe I left her there. It's strange how moments of heartbreak seem to defy time, stretching them out endlessly, like slow-motion scenes from a film. But the decision to walk out of that house, leaving Emma behind, naked, drunk, and oblivious to what she'd done, took no time at all. My legs just moved on their own, driven by an instinct to flee before the humiliation drowned me completely. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The cold night air hit me hard as I stumbled out of Paul's house, my breath ragged and uneven. The roar of the party behind me faded the moment I stepped into the street. I gripped my car door with shaking hands, as though the metal could somehow ground me. But it didn't. My mind raced, replaying the scene inside over and over again. Her bare skin, his grin, the whispers and gasps from the crowd. I started the engine, my hands trembling against the steering wheel, and drove. I wasn't thinking about where I was going, only about escaping. Streetlights streaked across the windshield, each flicker casting shadows that twisted and warped, mirroring the storm of emotions inside me. The rage came first, hot and all-consuming, but it didn't last long. It was quickly replaced by something worse, something quieter. Shame. The kind of shame that clings to your skin, seeps into your bones, and whispers that you'll never be able to wash it off. I wanted to scream, to punch something, anything, but all I could do was grip the wheel until my knuckles went white. I don't remember how long I drove. Hours, maybe. The streets blurred into a haze of neon signs and empty intersections. At some point, I pulled into a deserted parking lot and just sat there, the engine idling beneath me. My phone buzzed several times in my pocket. Texts, probably. Maybe Emma was looking for me. Maybe she wasn't. I didn't care enough to check. When I finally cut the engine, silence filled the car like a heavy fog, suffocating and absolute. I stared out through the windshield, watching as the night stretched on, vast and empty. What the hell just happened? That question kept playing on a loop in my head, each time more bitter than the last. How had we ended up here? Emma and I had built a life together. Something real, something I thought was unshakable. We'd survived arguments, tough financial patches, and family drama. But none of it prepared me for this. None of it prepared me for the image of her body, my wife's body, so freely displayed for a room full of strangers, and all for the amusement of a man I didn't even know. When the first light of morning broke over the horizon, I still hadn't moved. Exhaustion weighed heavily on my chest, but I knew I wouldn't sleep even if I tried. I drove home instead, not because I wanted to be there, but because I had nowhere else to go. I had barely stepped through the front door when I heard the knocking. At first, I thought it was just the remnants of the party's chaos ringing in my ears, some leftover noise my mind couldn't shake. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by muffled sobs. It was Emma. She was on the other side of the door, crying, begging me to let her in. "Please let me in," she whimpered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I stood on the other side, my hand hovering over the doorknob. For a moment, I thought about opening it, about letting her stumble in, seeing her face streaked with tears and guilt. Maybe she'd explain everything away, offer me some excuse that would make it all seem like a drunken mistake. Maybe I'd believe her, but I didn't move. Instead, I stood there listening to her cry through the door, my heart a tangled mess of anger and sorrow. Letting her in would mean facing the reality of what had happened, and I wasn't ready for that. "Not yet. Please talk to me," she begged, her voice breaking. "It didn't mean anything. I swear." I clenched my fists, pressing them hard against the door, as though the pressure could hold everything together. My dignity, my sanity, my broken pride. But the cracks were already spreading. "I love you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I squeezed my eyes shut, every word cutting deeper than the last. I couldn't do it. I couldn't let her in. Eventually, the sobs faded, replaced by silence. I waited until I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway, followed by the dull thud of her car door closing. Then I sank to the floor, my back pressed against the door, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The weight of what had happened crashed over me like a tidal wave. I thought that was the worst of it, but it wasn't. At around 3 p.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call or a text. It was a video message. I opened it without thinking, and within seconds, my world shattered all over again. It was Emma, and that man, the one she'd been glued to all night, was filming everything. The video showed it all. Their whispered conversations, the stolen touches, the moment they slipped away from the crowd together. Then it cut to the part I'd been dreading. Her completely naked, running out of the room in drunken abandon. Laughter echoed in the background, cruel and mocking, as the camera followed her stumble down the hallway. The man's voice was laced with amusement as he narrated the scene. "There she goes. Your perfect little wife." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, my chest tightening with a rage so fierce it nearly consumed me. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just a drunken night gone wrong. It was deliberate. It was humiliating. And now there was proof that would live forever in the digital world, just waiting to surface and tear apart whatever shred of dignity I had left. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the weight of betrayal pressing down on every inch of my soul. Something dark bloomed inside me, something primal. This wasn't going to end with an apology or a tearful confession. No, this was war. I needed to find him, the man who had done this to me. The man who had taken everything I thought I knew about my life and shattered it with a single night's entertainment. Without hesitation, I grabbed my car keys and stormed out of the house, my mind set on one thing and one thing. I barely remember driving to his place, just the blur of pavement under my wheels, each mile swallowed by a growing rage that pulsed in my chest like a second heartbeat. I wasn't thinking clearly. All I knew was that I had to find him, the man who had turned my wife into a spectacle and dragged me into this hell. By the time I reached his apartment complex, The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the wheel so hard my fingers went numb, trying to rein in the storm inside me. But there was no stopping it. He had filmed her. He had laughed at me. And now, that video existed forever, a ticking time bomb, ready to explode my life into pieces all over again. I stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind me, and made my way toward the apartment building. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the directory by the entrance. I found his name, Nathan Cole, etched neatly next to a number. Apartment 204. The elevator creaked as it carried me up to the second floor, the stale air inside thick with the smell of cigarette smoke. My reflection in the scratched mirror startled me. I looked like a stranger. My eyes were bloodshot, my jaw clenched so tight it ached, and a wildness flickered behind my gaze that I couldn't recognize. When the elevator doors opened, I walked slowly down the hallway, each step heavy with purpose. The only sound was the distant hum of a TV coming from behind one of the apartment doors. When I reached 204, I paused, my hand hovering over the buzzer. For a split second, doubt crept in. Was this really the answer? Would confronting him make any of this pain go away? But then I thought of the video, the way Emma laughed with him, the way he sneered at the camera like I was nothing but a joke. The rage surged back, silencing everything else. I pounded on the door. It took a moment, but I heard footsteps on the other side, slow and deliberate. The door swung open, and there he was, Nathan. He was taller than I remembered, his hair disheveled, wearing a lazy grin like he already knew why I was there. Well, he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. Didn't think I'd see you again so soon? His voice was laced with mockery, and the sight of him standing there, so smug, made my blood boil. I didn't say a word. I just lunged. The first punch caught him off guard, knocking him backward into the apartment. He stumbled, and before he could recover, I was on him, swinging wildly. My fists connected with his jaw, his ribs, anywhere I could land a blow. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't even feeling. There was only the overwhelming need to hurt him, to erase the shame he had inflicted on me. He fought back, but his drunken reflexes were slow. I felt the crack of his nose beneath my knuckles, and he let out a groan, collapsing to the floor. Blood dripped from his face, and for a moment, he just lay there dazed. But it wasn't enough. I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall, rage pouring out of me like a flood. Did you think this was funny? I growled, my voice shaking. You think you can ruin my life and get away with it? He coughed, spitting blood onto the floor. It was just a joke, man, just a stupid joke. A joke. That's what this was to him. A drunken night, a quick laugh at my expense, something he'd forget by morning. But for me, it was everything. I slammed him against the wall again, harder this time, feeling his body go limp under my grip. You don't get to walk away from this, I hissed. He groaned in pain, his smugness shattered, replaced by fear. Okay, stop, he gasped. Just take it easy. I wanted to keep hitting him, to pummel him until he felt even a fraction of the humiliation I'd endured. But something stopped me, something cold and terrifying that whispered in the back of my mind. If you keep going, you won't be able to stop. I released him, letting him slump to the floor. He gasped for air, clutching his ribs, his face a swollen mess of blood and bruises. I stood over him, my chest heaving, struggling to catch my breath. You don't ever come near me or my wife again, I said, my voice low and deadly. If I see you, if I even hear your name, I'll finish what I started. Do you understand? He nodded weakly, his hands raised in surrender. I turned and stumbled toward the door, my head swimming with adrenaline and exhaustion. As I stepped out into the hallway, I felt a strange numbness wash over me. Not relief, not satisfaction, just emptiness. I'd hurt him. I'd made him pay. But somehow, it didn't feel like enough. When I got home, the house was silent. I sat on the couch, my fists still aching from the fight, and stared at the wall. I thought about Emma, about the way she had cried at the door earlier, the way she had begged me to let her in. The phone buzzed beside me again, another text from her. Please let me explain. I was drunk. It didn't mean anything. I stared at the message, my mind numb. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that everything could be undone, that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back from this. But then I remembered the video, and I knew. There was no going back. The days that followed felt like I was drifting through someone else's life. Nothing around me seemed real. Not the sound of my phone buzzing with Emma's endless texts, not the stale quiet that had settled over the house, and certainly not the mess of emotions that churned inside me like a storm with no end in sight. I stayed inside for days, locking the door, curtains drawn tight, letting the world outside carry on without me. Sleep barely came. When it did, I dreamed of her, of Emma's bare body running through that hallway, of the laughter, the humiliation. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, the image burned into my mind. There was no escaping it. I ignored Emma's messages for as long as I could. But she was relentless. Every few hours, another text would appear, each more desperate than the last. Please talk to me. I can't stand this silence. It didn't mean anything, I swear. The part of me that still loved her wanted to answer, to let her explain, to believe that this nightmare was just a drunken mistake. But the other part, the one that had watched her flirt with Nathan all night, the one that had seen her collapse naked on the floor in front of everyone, knew better. Some things can't be undone with apologies. By the third day, the silence was suffocating. I needed air. I left the house without checking my phone, without telling anyone where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from the memories, from her, from myself. I drove aimlessly for hours, through the suburbs, past coffee shops and parks filled with people who had no idea how lucky they were to live ordinary lives. Eventually, I ended up at the park Emma and I used to visit when we first started dating. It felt strange sitting on the same bench where we had once made plans for the future, back when everything felt simple and solid. I sat there for a long time, staring at the lake, watching the wind ripple across the surface. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't feel peace. The past sat heavy on my chest, making it hard to breathe. By the time I returned home, night had fallen, and Emma was waiting for me. She stood on the porch, wrapped in a coat too light for the chilly autumn air, her eyes swollen and red from crying. When she saw me pull into the driveway, she stepped forward, her hands trembling at her sides. "I need to talk to you," she whispered the moment I got out of the car, her voice raw with exhaustion. For a second, I considered walking past her, locking her out again, leaving her to wrestle with her guilt alone. But something inside me gave way, just a crack, just enough to let her in. Without a word, I unlocked the door and walked inside. Emma followed, closing the door behind her. She stood in the entryway, fidgeting with the edge of her coat, her eyes darting nervously around the room. I could see the guilt written all over her face, the way her lips trembled as she searched for the right words. "I know I messed up," she began softly, her voice barely audible. "I know what I did was unforgivable." I stayed silent, leaning against the wall, waiting. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she continued, her hands twisting together. "I was drunk. I wasn't thinking. Nathan, he kept buying me drinks, and I didn't know how to stop. She trailed off, her eyes glistening with tears. I felt a flicker of something, sympathy maybe, but it was buried beneath layers of anger and betrayal, too deep to reach. "You didn't know how to stop?" I repeated, my voice cold. "That's what you're telling me?" Emma winced, her shoulders sagging under the weight of my words. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "I swear I didn't." I shook my head slowly, the bitterness rising in my throat. "You didn't just hurt me, Emma. You humiliated me. In front of everyone." Her breath hitched, and she stepped closer, her eyes pleading. "Please, I made a mistake, a horrible mistake. But I love you, and I can't lose you. Please tell me we can fix this." Fix this. As if patching over what she had done would somehow erase the memory of that night. The laughter, the video, the betrayal. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I didn't see the woman I had married. I saw a stranger who had made choices I couldn't begin to understand, choices that had ripped apart the life we had built together. I don't know if I can. I said quietly, my voice cracking under the weight of the truth. Emma collapsed onto the couch, her head in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. The sight of her broken like this should have moved me. But instead, all I felt was exhaustion. I sat down across from her, rubbing my temples, trying to find clarity in the chaos. "Why, Nathan?" I asked, more to myself than to her. "Why did you go to him?" Emma sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I don't know," she whispered. "He was just there, and I felt lost, like I wasn't good enough anymore, like we weren't good enough." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known things between us weren't perfect, but I never imagined she felt that way. "So, you decided to throw everything away?" I asked bitterly. "Because you felt what? Bored? Insecure?" She shook her head desperately. "No, it wasn't like that. It was a mistake, just a stupid, drunken mistake. I was trying to feel something, anything, but it wasn't worth it. Nothing about it was worth losing you." I stared at her, feeling the weight of her confession settle over me like a stone. It wasn't an excuse, not one that made sense anyway, but it was the truth. And the truth, ugly as it was the only thing we had left between us. For the first time since that night, I felt the edges of my anger soften, just slightly. Not enough to forgive her. Not yet, but enough to make me wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I admitted, my voice low. "But I know I can't keep living like this. Hating you, hating everything." Emma nodded slowly, her tears still falling, but her expression lighter, like a weight had been lifted. "I'll do anything," she whispered. "Whatever it takes." I sat back, exhaling slowly. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but if we try, things have to change. Everything has to change." She nodded again, a flicker of hope crossing her tear-streaked face. We sat there in silence, the weight of the past still heavy between us, but no longer unbearable. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a start, a fragile. The days after Emma's confession were suffocating in their own way. We agreed to try to rebuild whatever was left of us, but it wasn't the kind of decision you make with certainty. It was more like standing at the edge of a crumbling bridge, knowing the path forward was dangerous, but the only other option was to fall. Our home became a silent battleground. Every glance, every conversation felt weighted, like a misstep could send everything spiraling again. We slept in the same bed, but the space between us was wide and cold. Emma kept to her side, curling into herself, and I stayed on mine, pretending to sleep but staring at the ceiling for hours. Some nights, I'd hear her crying softly, muffled by the blankets, but I never reached out. I couldn't. I wanted to feel sympathy for her, for us, but every time I tried, the memory of that night rose like a black tide, swallowing any warmth I might have had left. We tried to find a new rhythm, but it was awkward, forced. Conversations about groceries and chores felt strange, like we were actors playing roles in a performance neither of us wanted to be in anymore. Emma quit drinking entirely. I didn't ask her to, she just did. I suppose it was her way of trying to prove she was serious, that she was willing to change. But no amount of sobriety could erase the past. And no matter how much she tried to avoid it, the specter of that video haunted every moment we shared. I hadn't told her about it. She didn't know it existed. I kept that knowledge buried deep, too ashamed to admit that somewhere out there was footage of her betrayal, stored on a stranger's phone. The weight of it hung over me constantly, like a sword dangling by a thread. What if Nathan sent it to others? What if it surfaced online? What if it was weaponized against me someday? A cruel reminder that I had been that man, the one who couldn't keep his wife faithful. I told myself I'd handled it by confronting him, but in truth, I knew I hadn't. I hadn't stopped anything. I had just lashed out in anger, hoping it would be enough. But it wasn't. About a week later, I found myself sitting at the dining table, staring at the cracked screen of my phone. I kept scrolling through old messages, Emma's texts from before everything unraveled when life was normal. Pictures of vacations, lazy mornings, stupid little moments that had once seemed insignificant, but now felt like artifacts from a different life. She came into the room quietly, as if afraid to disturb me. I glanced up briefly, catching her watching me with that nervous, guilt-ridden look she'd worn since the party. She seemed smaller somehow, like a version of herself folded in on itself, waiting for me to say something, anything, that would offer some semblance of forgiveness. "Do you hate me?" she asked softly, sitting down across from me. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. "I don't know," I said, which was the closest to the truth I could manage. "I hate what you did. I hate how it makes me feel." She nodded slowly, absorbing the blow like someone who expected nothing less. "I hate it too," she whispered. "I hate myself for it." I wanted her words to comfort me, but they didn't. I realized then that remorse doesn't heal the way people think it does. Her guilt didn't soothe my wounds. It just added another layer of weight to the mess we were tangled in. The next morning, I woke to another message from Nathan. My heart sank before I even opened it. "We need to talk." I stared at the words, my pulse pounding in my ears. I knew that responding would be dangerous, would reopen a wound that hadn't even begun to scab over. But ignoring it felt even worse. I typed back quickly, "What do you want?" His reply came almost instantly. "I think you want to hear this. Come meet me." I gritted my teeth, the memory of our last encounter flashing in my mind. The way I had beaten him, left him bleeding on the floor. The thought of seeing him again made my skin crawl, but the nagging fear of what he might do with the video left me no choice. I didn't tell Emma where I was going. She didn't ask. She knew better than to push. I met Nathan at a rundown coffee shop on the edge of town, the kind of place where people go when they want to be left alone. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in the corner, a baseball cap pulled low over his bruised face. He looked up as I approached, his mouth twisting into a half-smile. "You hit harder than I thought you would," he said, his voice raspy. I ignored the comment and sat down across from him. "What do you want?" He leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Relax, man. I'm not here to cause trouble. I wanted to make things right. Right?" I scoffed. "You think you can fix this?" Nathan sighed, running a hand over his jaw. "Look, I messed up. I thought it was funny at the time, but I get it now. It wasn't." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive, sliding it across the table. "The video. I deleted it from my phone, but I figured you'd want this for peace of mind." I stared at the flash drive, my stomach churning. "Why?" I asked, my voice low. "Why give this to me?" Nathan shrugged. "Because I'm tired, man. Tired of being that guy. And maybe I didn't want this hanging over either of us anymore." For a moment, I just sat there, stunned. I had spent so much time imagining revenge, retribution, something dark and twisted. But now, sitting across from the man who had humiliated me, all I felt was exhaustion. I took the flash drive and stood up, my legs shaky. "If I ever see you again," I began, but he held up a hand. "You won't," he said simply. I left without another word. That night, I sat on the couch, the flash drive resting in my palm like a heavy weight. Emma came into the room, her eyes questioning but cautious. "What's that?" she asked quietly. I turned the small plastic device over in my hand, the edges sharp against my skin. "The video," I said flatly. "It's gone now. For good." She blinked, her expression shifting between relief and something I couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or guilt. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. The road ahead was still long, still uncertain. Trust wasn't something I could summon overnight. And forgiveness? I wasn't sure if I'd ever get there. But for the first time, the weight of what had happened didn't feel unbearable. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The flash drive sat in the drawer of my desk for weeks, untouched. I didn't have the heart to destroy it, though I knew I should. Maybe part of me wanted to hold on to it as leverage, a reminder of the power it held over both Emma and me. Or maybe I was afraid that if I erased it completely, I'd have to confront the truth that no matter what I did, the memory of that night would never disappear. Emma and I tried in the way broken people try when there's nothing left to cling to but habit. We settled into a fragile routine, careful not to touch the cracks that ran between us. Every conversation was filtered through unspoken rules. Don't mention the past, don't bring up him, and don't ask for too much too soon. On the surface, things almost seemed normal again. We went through the motions of marriage, grocery shopping on Saturdays, dinner at the table with half-hearted smiles, the occasional movie night where we sat side by side but felt miles apart. We looked like a couple trying to rebuild, but I knew better. What we were doing wasn't rebuilding. It was survival. There was one night, months after everything happened, that I found myself standing in the doorway to our bedroom, watching Emma sleep. In the dim light, with her hair spilling over the pillow and her breathing soft and even, she looked peaceful. Innocent almost, but appearances are deceptive. I used to find comfort in moments like these, when everything felt still and safe. But now, all I could think about was how easily she had let someone else into our lives. How quickly trust could be shattered, leaving behind nothing but jagged edges. I still loved her, at least I thought I did. But love had become complicated, tangled with resentment and doubt. Every time she touched me, I wondered if her mind drifted back to Nathan. Every time she said she loved me, I questioned whether she really meant it, or if it was just a way to ease her guilt. Some nights, I lay awake next to her, trying to convince myself that forgiveness was possible. But forgiveness is a strange thing. People talk about it like it's a gift you give someone else. But the truth is, it's a burden you carry alone. You forgive because you need to move on, not because the other person deserves it. I wasn't sure if I had the strength to carry that burden. One rainy afternoon, Emma sat across from me at the dining table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I could tell she had something on her mind. Her gaze kept flicking toward me, hesitant and searching, like she was trying to gauge if I was ready to hear whatever it was she needed to say. "I know I hurt you," she whispered, her voice breaking through the quiet. "And I know you don't trust me. But I need to know if you think we'll ever be okay again." The vulnerability in her voice hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to give her the answer she was looking for, to tell her that we could move forward, that things would eventually go back to the way they were. But I knew that would be a lie. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I want to say yes. But the truth is, I don't think things will ever be the same." She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know how to make it right." "That's the thing," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I don't think you can. And I don't think I can either." We sat in silence, the weight of those words settling between us like stones. I had spent so long waiting for a resolution, some grand moment of closure that would make everything make sense. But life doesn't work that way. Some betrayals leave scars that never fully heal. And some wounds you just have to learn to live with. A few weeks later, I found myself standing on the shore of the same lake we used to visit when we were younger. Emma had stayed home that day. I told her I needed space, and for once she didn't argue. I stood at the water's edge, the wind cold against my skin, and pulled the flash drive from my pocket. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the weight of everything it represented, the shame, the anger, the loss. And then, without allowing myself to hesitate, I threw it into the lake. The splash was small, barely noticeable, but it felt like the end of something. Or maybe the beginning. When I got home that night, Emma was sitting on the couch, her knees drawn to her chest, watching me carefully. I sat down beside her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I reached for her hand. She looked at me, startled, and then slowly, she laced her fingers through mine. "Where do we go from here?" she asked quietly. I didn't have an answer, but maybe that was okay. Maybe life wasn't about finding answers, but about learning to live in the uncertainty. "We just go," I said finally. She nodded, and for the first time in a long time, we sat together without the weight of the past pressing down on us. The future was still uncertain, still filled with questions that might never be answered. But in that moment, it was enough. And maybe, just maybe, that was all we needed.